Welcome to another episode of the Curious Mind podcast. My name is Gabriel Ellis. I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist. And in the last episode, I started to summarize the mature work of Sigmund Freud, who famously is the forefather of psychoanalysis and to some respect also was the avant-garde in modernizing psychotherapy more than 120 years ago. I wanted to start with some questions that came up from the past, from the last video, and to deepen also the topic that I went into last time, which is mostly the so-called superego, which I will talk about a little bit, why this description is not so good, this translation, and the I, or the so-called ego. So the first question that came up was, why was this part of the mind that is unconscious and is the storehouse of the old inherited drives, why did Freud call it the it? And here already the comment on the translation. Already in the lifetime of Sigmund Freud, he had psychoanalytic students who dedicated themselves to translate his work into English. Strachey was the translator who did that, and already in his lifetime, Freud approved of the wording of Strachey, which was to use for the German es, which is literally translated just the personal pronoun it, for it to use the Latinized id, for I to use the Latinized ego, for the Über-Ich to use the Latin translation, the superego. Now, those translations have been criticized already enough. I am one of those. I think that with those rather technically sounding terms, it goes away from what Freud used in the original German, which is basically to give them very mundane labels that easily relate to our own life. And when we give them Latin words, then it sounds like a technical thing and, a concept that is far away. So at least I stick to a literal translation to help you to integrate it into your understanding. So for is it, for I, for the ich, I in English, and for Über-Ich in English, I use the awkward term above I, and it's not a good term, but it will be clear to you why I use that. So the question is, why did Freud use this word it, which is so general and vague? And this goes back to Freud's work, the I and the it, or the ego and the id, if you look up the translation from 1923. And in there, he already refers to another practitioner, a medical practitioner who also was interested in psychoanalysis, which was Georg Groddeck. In the same year, he published a book which is called The Book of the It. And Freud got a preprint of this book. So in the book of his, which is the I and the it, or the ego and the id, he refers to this work of Groddeck. And a quote that Freud brings, and I think my quote here is a little bit longer than what is in Freud's work. This is a quote from Groddeck that explains this wording. I am of the opinion that man is lived by the unknown, is lived by the unknown. There is an it in him, something wonderful that regulates everything he does and everything that happens to him. The sentence, I live, is only partially correct. It expresses a small partial phenomenon of the basic truth, man is lived by it, end quote. Now, this idea of the it as the unknown inside of us that actually lives us, and we as individuals, as conscious I, we only believe that we are living. Actually, we are lived. This idea Freud believed that Groddeck took over from Nietzsche, who lived only a few decades before them, but this is in fact not true. This has been researched. Groddeck actually refers to something like natural mystics of the 18th and 19th century. So Groddeck believed that nature is kind of the great vessel for what is then become the mind, and nature lives through the mind, through the humans, and there's only this one speck of an I that believes that it is the agent, where in fact nature is the agent. And for this natural force, for this source of nature, he just termed it with this general it, because nature is so vast and is everywhere around us. Freud liked this term, took it over from Groddeck, but he did not use it in the same sense. He apparently was just fascinated by the idea to give a name to those forces that came through nature, but more in the way of our inherited, genetically formed drives that we are born with. The term of the Über-Ich, Latin English translation superego, which sounds like Superman or something, it sounds weird. So I keep the too literal translation, the above I. This is a term that Freud started to use in the same publication from 1923, which, just to remind you, is about 40 years after he started to work professionally and to publish, so quite a while after. Now, before that already, Freud used the word the self-ideal or the ideal self, and then he, in 1923, started to replace it with the Über-Ich, with the above I. And he used this word because, as I will show in a little bit now when I go into it in detail, but to tell it already now, he used this term because in a way he believed that this layer of the mind inside of us that regulates our do's and don'ts and mustn'ts is the higher principle in humanity. That when we refer to morals, to ethics, to what makes humans honorable and kind of standing above just mammals, he believed that this is to a large part due to this part of what develops from the I, and so he called it the above I, the Über-Ich, which is above the I. So this is why I use this awkward term, because it just signifies what he had in mind, where in fact superego might be literally correct, but we are not so much using anymore the Latin in its literal sense, and so it changes into something else when we use the English word superego. Or sometimes I see in publications over I, but it doesn't again signify how Freud believed that this is the source of the good, the morally good, the social good, the community good. So this is why I will stick to above I henceforth. To go a little bit more into that, to recap, but also to expand on what I mentioned in the last episode. In the beginning for Freud, all the libido, all the libidinous energy, the life energy, or you make it a little bit more understandable, the fascination is in the it. Whenever you are fascinated by something, this is libidinous energy. So in the beginning for Freud, the source of it is the it. Then the it starts to project, which means to throw out, to project parts of the libido onto objects. And above all, these are at the beginning close people, if you think about babies and toddlers. But then the it projects this libidinous energy also onto objects like toys, onto music, for example, then later money, work, ideas, and other things. The ego then identify the ego. So the it throws the libidinous energy out. It projects it and finds fascination in the mother, the breast of the mother, the music, the toys. The it finds fascination there. Now the ego, according to Freud, starts to identify itself with these objects or these people, starts to identify itself with its mother, with its father, with the toys. And so it introjects the object libido. So the it throws out the libido, and then the ego brings it back again into itself. A very simple example is music. If there is a tune that you like, a tune that you're fascinated with, then you like to listen to it over and over again. On this stage, the libidinous energy is on the object of the music, what comes out of the loudspeakers. Now, what the ego does is it identifies itself with it, it introjects it and brings it into itself. And this is when we hear the melody as an earworm inside of our head, when we remind ourselves of the melody, when we whistle it, when we hum it, when the desire comes up to hear it again. This is the internal part, which is just a sign, or it's an example of how we internalize this fascination, and we are able to repeat it in our minds, and we are not dependent on the external object anymore. So this is how the ego, the I, identifies itself with these people and these objects, then introjects, brings it back, the libido, into itself. And in this way, these new paths of what has now become effectively the above I, the I is acknowledges the fascination, brings it back, and as it is going back into the mind, this is forming the above I, the what is otherwise called the superego. And so the fascination, the love, is now inside of me. The love for the object is a love for an internalized object. This is the above I. The first introjects, in particular, that are brought in, which is the fascination with the mother, the fascination with the father, are close to the it, because the it has this love affair with those internalized objects and is opposed to the I. And why it is opposed to the I will become clear now. Here's a quote from Freud. The Über-Ich is a monument to the former weakness and dependence of the I, and continues its rule over the mature I. So to read it again, the Über-Ich is a monument to the former weakness and dependence of the I, of the small child, the toddler, which is so dependent on its parents. And the Über-Ich continues its rule over the mature I, which means even when we grow up, when we get older, we might be further away from the dominance of our factual parents, but we have not escaped the dominance of the Über-Ich, of the above I inside ourselves. To continue the quote, just as the child was forced to obey its parents, the I submits to the categorical imperative of its Über-Ich. Again, just as the child was forced to obey its parents, the I submits to the Über-Ich. And this is the opposition of the Über-Ich, of the above I, towards the I, because what we internalize from those very first so-called objects, which are our mother and our father, are, according to Freud, rules. The do's, the don'ts, the have-tos, the mustn'ts. And because those rules are in opposition to the its demands of immediate drive satisfaction, because of that, the Über-Ich is opposed to the I. The I wants to fulfill those demands, and it is prohibited, it is limited, it is hindered by the Über-Ich in the immediate satisfaction of its drives. And so the I goes into opposition to the Über-Ich, to the above I. The parents' commands and prohibitions, as I said, now appear as conscience. So as soon as I internalize those rules, I'm not in opposition against the parents anymore. I might be in opposition to the internalized rules, but if I agree with them, then they appear as a conscience. I've done something wrong, and then I feel bad. The feeling of guilt, the feeling of bad conscience. And this in turn also opens up, according to Freud, the connection to the social world. When I have an internal compass, a moral compass, a compass that in fact consists of internalized rules from the parents, then this is an instance of social connection that applies to the social realm in total. It was before regulating only my immediate surrounding with my parents. I internalized it, and now I'm walking around with this ethical compass inside of me, and this helps me to regulate the closeness, the connections with other people, with strangers on the street, with public spaces, at work, and in relationships. So this opens me up to become a social being, and this is exactly why Freud believed that the Über-Ich, that the above I, has such a crucial role in making humans better than the natural, brutal drives that animals are confronted with. This is what distinguishes humans. Now, as I just said, it projects libidinous energy, and then the I identifies with it and brings it back into itself. But if there are too many introjects that are incompatible with each other, only think of, to simplify it, the parents representing different parenting roles. Let's say the mother is more strict, the father is more forgiving and allowing. So then I have two sets of rules internalized from the father. I have the internalized rule of let me do it, let me try things, let me experiment, let me fail. And from the mother, I have the sense of don't do it, don't take any risks, stay at home, and so on. So whenever an urge comes to explore, then I'm split inside from in between the two parts of the part that wants to encourage me, that wants me to try and do it, and the part that inhibits me. I have introjected two incompatible parts, and when this happens, the I splits into fragments because the individual identifications clothe themselves off through resistance to one another. Just imagine, a household situation where my parents indeed are having an argument about parenting styles, and they don't come to an agreement. So my father defends his position, my mother defends her position. They clash, and they don't agree with each other. They find no compromise. I internalize this, and this is very simply put, but just imagine this is what Freud means, that the struggle continues on inside of me. Those individual parts are closed off, they don't agree with each other, and this is what keeps up the fragmentation of the I, the fragmentation of the voices inside of me. Now, with the help of the above I, the I develops from drive obedience to the it to drive inhibition. So the over I, the Über-Ich, effectively limits the it. And so the I comes in control of parts of the it. And this is fundamental for Freud, for the late Freud. He aims at the I gaining parts, gaining regions from the it and bringing it under the control of the I. Because this, for him, if it is an organized I, if it is an I that is integrated within itself, then it is very much able to do its job, which is to navigate between it, above I, and reality. This is possible when the I has conquered a lot of ground from the it. If it is not, then we get into issues, And this is what I will describe pretty soon in the practical application of the psychoanalysis at the time of the late Freud. So the I in this position can be compared to, and use the metaphor of the rider who, with borrowed strength, has to rein in the superior strength of the horse. The rider obviously is not as strong as the horse, but he aims to control the horse, to channel its energies into the direction where they want to go. And this is, for Freud, the I. The borrowed strength first comes from the above I, and then it comes from psychoanalysis. And together, so to speak, the I and the above I, the I with the psychoanalyst, they can battle those grounds with the it, bring them under the control of the ego. So psychoanalysis is an expanded tool that is intended to enable the I to progressively conquer the it. And here's it became almost a psychoanalytic statement, a saying, an expression of Freud, where it was, I shall become. I don't want to be governed, I want to govern. And this territory I claim from the it. And by the way, this quote is coming from the so-called new series of lectures on an introduction to psychoanalysis, which was published in 1933. Now, if the I does not overcome the challenges, and here especially the psychosexual developments that Freud is so keen on describing, but I don't go into it. So if the I does not overcome its challenges in its development, then the organization of the I is weakened in adulthood. It has not integrated the difficult experiences it had, the child, the maturing child, the adolescent, and then the adult. And so the I is weak in its structure because there are so many important things that are outside of the I, that are still in conflict, that are still in the it. And so it has not overcome those challenges, and its organization is weak. Partly this is also due to the libido parts that remain fixated on very early objects, let's say the mother's breast, or certain toys, or certain aspects of its body that it has not integrated. And so there are still the libidos kind of trapped in these objects, and it didn't go back where it belongs to, namely into the I, into the over I. So if there are problems in adulthood, if the adult faces difficult situations, then sometimes the libido returns to these early fixations. And here you can imagine when adults face major difficulties, slip into what we then call a depression, and then develop a behavioral style that fits more a child. They lie in bed, they are passive. To give a dramatic example, they will suck at their thumb, which is obviously baby behavior. Some adults do that, and this is called regression. So that when we develop problems, we go back to early fixations, physical postures that gave us comfort, activities that gave us comfort, objects that gave us comfort. And so this is how we regress into an earlier time of our life, and we display these behaviors. This regression that I mentioned now, which is to become passive, to suck your thumb, and so on, this would be a regression to the earliest phase of life, in the phases that Freud identified, a phase of demonstrative, obvious helplessness. And the craving is for someone to come and to save me. We can also regress into the second phase of life, which Freud associates with control and aggressiveness. This is when children show resistance, they rebel, they have tantrums, and so on. We can regress also to this. And in the adults, in mature people, this shows as undifferentiated aggression, as stubbornness, as controlling behavior, as jealous behavior. So this is a regression also into early childhood, but to the second stage of life. Now let's come to the practice of psychoanalysis. For Freud, the tools of psychoanalysis are mainly dreams, the discussion and interpretation of dreams, a phenomenon that is called transference. Third, the comments from the analyst in the psychoanalytic sessions, and the so-called free associations. The free associations is, according to Freud, when patients express their thoughts freely and without any censorship, whether it makes sense to them or not. So the analyst encourages the patient to just develop a stream of consciousness and to verbalize that. This is a technique that he used pretty early on. He starts describing that in the studies on hysteria from 1895, which is pretty much the beginning of his psychoanalytic concepts and work. There's another method that he uses in psychoanalysis, which is errors that we make, slips of tongue, the proverbial Freudian slips, when we forget important information, when we lose objects, when we have oversights that should not happen. This he analyzes, and he started doing that also pretty early on. And the publication where you find most of these examples and the theory behind that is in the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, published in 1901, pretty early on again. Let me describe now in a bit more detail the two main methods that he also emphasizes in his mature work in the last decades of his life. The analysis of dreams is something that he started with in 1900 with his major publication, and he continued to do so. The question is, for Freud, why do we dream at all? For Freud, in the dream, the it presses on consciousness with its various demands, and it does so in daily life, of course, but it does so also during sleep. And those pressures on the I, those pressures on consciousness, disturb the sleep. But the I, which it wants to ensure the sleep, it is the protector of sleep, because probably the biological function, we have to sleep. So the I, for survival, wants to keep up and maintain the deep sleep. The I, in order to meet or to address those drive pressures from the it tricks it. And it tricks it with the dream. And in the dream, it fakes the immediate fulfillment of the wishes. Again, as a reminder, the it wants an immediate satisfaction. It does so also in sleep. The I doesn't want to let the body wake up to interrupt the recharging during the sleep. And so it creates a scenario, it creates a fantasy in which wish fulfillment happens, and this is the dream. So essentially, for Freud, dream is always wish fulfillment in a more or less hidden way. To give you a very simple example, let's say we go to bed hungry, and so the it continues to push with the demands to satisfy this hunger, but for some reason we cannot, and so the I creates a dream where we eat to our heart's content, the most delicious things. So this is faking an immediate drive satisfaction, a need satisfaction. For Freud, what we perceive in the dream, the content of the dream, is the so-called manifest dream process. So this is what is clearly visible. This is what we usually remember when we wake up, if we remember our dreams. This is the manifest dream. But behind that lies the real dream process, which Freud calls the latent dream thought. And this is the important thing. This is what is actually the demands and the conflicts of the it. This latent dream thought becomes a manifest dream through something that Freud calls the dream work, in which the unpleasant dream wishes, if they are unpleasant, are concealed. with the dream work, the I thus defends itself against certain contents of the unconscious it. So again, the it presses forward with its demands, and some of the demands can be pretty uncomfortable for us, for the I. And if it's too uncomfortable, we would wake up from the anxiety, from the terror, from the discomfort. And the I wants to prevent that. And so it conceals the message of the it, the push, the drive of the it. However, in order to do that, the fulfillment of the wishes means fantasies, the fantasies of the manifest dream. The concealment happens with using two tools. The I uses the tool of condensation and the tool of displacement. These are technical terms that Freud introduced. There are a few more tools, but these are the important ones. Condensation means when one element of the manifest dream contains several latent dream thoughts. For example, in my dream, I meet a friend who has my father's voice. Both have been critical to me. My father, to remind myself of my father's criticism, would be too uncomfortable in the dream. At the same time, my friend also, maybe we're business partners, also has started to criticize me on certain occasions. These two create conflicts in me, and they are put together in this image of my friend criticizing me. And only in hindsight, I remember that in this dream, he criticized me in the way that my dad used to do. So two ideas in this example are put together, they are condensed. And in this example, the I has managed to take away aspects of the discomfort by switching the most uncomfortable latent ideas to my friends. And my friend's criticism is something that bothers me, but is much more manageable than my father's criticism. This is condensation, where one thing in the dream contains several ideas that we have to deconstruct. We have to unbox these in our dream analysis. The second principle of concealment is displacement. Displacement means that the intensity or relevance of one element shifts to another. For example, if I have a sexual desire for a friend's wife in the dream, so this would be the latent thought, the latent dream thought, but it is very uncomfortable because I both respect my friend and his wife. In the dream, I dream of a woman that I have a sexual desire to. She's a completely unknown stranger, but she has the same name of my friend's wife. So this is the displacement. There's intensity, the latent, the actual intensity is on the desire of my friend's wife. In the dream, it has switched to a completely different person, and the link between the two is just that this stranger in my dream has the same name. So in other words, dreams are always the result of a conflict. On the one hand, we have the wish fulfillment of the it, but it can be frightening for the I. And so the I tries to limit the conflictuous, the difficult, the uncomfortable aspects of the content, the latent content of the dream. And we wake up only if the wish is not fulfilled in the dream. We have not managed to trick the it. It continues to press us forth with its demands. And this is, according to Freud, when we wake up because the content has become too unpleasant. Obviously, in dreams, the logic is unimportant. It's unimportant to the it. It is primarily concerned with discharging its excitement, to press forth with its drives and its demands and its needs. So the it is not a logically structured entity, at least not the everyday logic that we think in, that we think with. The meaning of the dream, by the way, the latent content, and this Freud is very clear on, cannot be reconstructed using some dream lexicon or some standardized interpretations, as sometimes caricatures of psychoanalysis have said. Freud himself says that the reconstruction can only happen with the dreamer's association. And if you go back to to my last episode, I described this a little bit more in detail. For Freud, consciousness is fundamentally fragmented. We don't know everything that is inside of us, so there are gaps. And healing for Freud is to a large part to close these gaps in our understanding. A more contemporary term for it today is to make the self more integrated, to integrate our experience, to integrate our past into ourselves, into the I, into this consciousness. This is something that Freud already had as an image for healing. And so it makes sense that this integration, filling those gaps, cannot be done just by somebody telling me the interpretation of the dream or me looking it up on the internet. What does it mean when my teeth fall out? What does it mean when I see a big wave or so in the dream? This cannot close those gaps because it comes from the outside. Closing the gaps have to be fundamentally connected to me and to my experience, to my understanding. So this is why interpretation of dreams and in general healing is a highly personalized, highly individual process. Okay, now in dreams, it becomes apparent that when the I breaks off the relationship with the outside world, which is when we sleep, and when it withdraws from the sensory organs, so we don't perceive anymore through the eyes, we don't hear sounds anymore from the outside, so the I withdraws from the sensory organs, then the I dives into the it. And here he sees a link to neurosis. Because what is now crucial for Freud is that the same mechanism of dream formation also helps us to understand neuroses. Now, neurosis is a bit antiquated word. What do they mean? Up until the mid-century of the 20th century, the 50s, 40s, 50s, they were using this word neurosis. Today, we would call it different terms. For example, melancholy or depression, anxiety, OCD, or psychosomatic diseases. So this is when we hear Freud speaking of neurosis, this is what we have to keep in mind. So essentially for Freud, what happens in dreams is very much a similar thing as what happens in those mental diseases and those neuroses. And this is why he emphasized dream understanding, the logic of dreams, in order to use it, to apply it to the clinical work in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. So in those neuroses, Freud also sees that the ego is weakened, not because we are sleeping or something, but because the it is strong, too strong, or the over-I, the Über-Ich, is too strong. Both can weaken us. The it with its pushes, the above I with the restraints. What then happens is that the organization of the I is loosened. We start to misunderstand what we are doing. We are afraid to lose our minds. We are afraid to keep it together, that we cannot keep it together anymore. So these are all expressions for what Freud calls that the I is loosening or losing its organization. When that happens, because the I is the interface with the outside world, when the I is weakened, then also the relationship to reality is weakened. And then as a consequence, the I resigns to the influence of the inner world, meaning the conflicts between the it and the Über-Ich, the above I. For Freud, the neurotic symptoms, and this is again very specifically connected to his psychosexual development in the childhood. For Freud, the neurotic symptoms are mainly either substitute satisfactions for sexual needs. So I've learned as a child, rather than to satisfy my sexual needs, to use substitutes because the punishment was severe, or the supposed punishment was too severe. So I learned to divert the energy. So the neurotic symptoms are either those substitute satisfactions, or they're measures to prevent sexual needs. The urge comes up, essentially of sexual nature for Freud. The urge comes up, but then I want to suppress it. I want to push it down. So I distract myself, or I do things to prevent their coming up. For example, compulsive behavior, washing hands, or maybe repeating a nursery rhyme in my mind, everything but just to experience what comes from within. For Freud, neuroses are not fundamentally different from the normal state. We can kind of understand it in the way that for Freud, to be a little bit neurotic is normal. Instead, neuroses and normal states of mind, they merge into one another because they have to essentially deal with the same conflicts, because also the normal, also the healthy mind is constantly trying to balance the conflicts of within with the outside world. It just does it successfully, whereas in neurosis, it is starting to fail because of too much pressure, too much of difficult situations, and so on. Freud is convinced that neuroses are only acquired in the first 6 years of life, the basis for the neuroses, and that only what appears later than in adulthood are only the symptoms of what happened in those first 6 years. This is why he was so adamant in going back, reconstructing the memory, understanding today's conflicts as a representation of childhood libidinous and sexual problems. I don't agree with this, but this is how he perceived it. Back then, as children, they develop repression mechanisms that work at the time, but they restrict, they impair the development later on. And as adults, those maladaptations, this lack of development, this manifests in adequate behavior towards other people, towards work, for example. Okay, so far for the dreams and how Freud related what happens in dreams to what happens in neurosis. Let me come to a tool that he also uses explicitly in psychoanalysis, which is transference. In clinical practice, Freud observed that patients express feelings and wishes that relate to the past and to the parents, but they transfer them to the therapist. What he means with that is, so Freud lets his patients associate, he lets them talk about the past. It becomes clear that they had a difficult relationship, let's say with a overly punishing father. The analyst makes some comments, and then suddenly the patients start to behave as if the father is speaking. They take a comment from the analyst as a stern punishment, as an unjustified criticism, and then they react towards the analyst kind of as if they were dealing with their father. And this replacement of the person of the analyst with an imminent person from the past, for example, the father or the mother, this is what Freud calls transference. So transference is a special kind of projection. The patient is projecting onto the canvas of the analyst and starts to see in them the father or the mother. Now, this is obviously a cognitive bias, so to speak, but for Freud, it has positive aspects. It's not only problematic. In a positive way, transference can lead to, first, the patient no longer wanting to get well just for themselves. Instead, the intention to get well is for the sake of the analyst, in order to please them, just as they would please their parent. Why is that an important part of psychoanalysis? Because many people who come conflicted into therapy, also normal therapy, or into psychoanalysis, their wish to become well is conflicted as well. This is a topic of its own. I might get into it in a later episode, but just to give you an example, let's say a person gets too little positive affection or attention in their lives. Such a person might develop symptoms of helplessness, of displayed discomfort, displayed sadness. Why? Because when they do so, when they call a friend, they say, and they ask them, how are you? And say, actually, not so good. And then they get the attention. Oh, what is it? Tell me about it. I'm so sorry that you feel this way. So effectively, unconsciously, they use the symptoms in order to get attention. And this is why they would be conflicted to get rid of those symptoms, because then where do I get my positive attention? Where do I get the confirmation from? So sometimes, not always, sometimes people come into therapy conflicted, not wanting in a way to get better. So when they start to transfer the transference, when they start to project it onto the analyst, and then wanting to impress them, wanting to behave in the way that the analyst wants them to behave in this positive transference, they skip the part that wants to stay sick for whatever reason, and they go into the pleasing the analyst and wanting to heal for them. In this sense, this is, for Freud at least, a positive event. Secondly, the analyst, as the quasi-parent, also gains access to the Über-Ich. They gain access to the above-I, just as the actual parents had the privileged access to the Über-Ich of the child. In this way, psychoanalysis can be used to re-educate the patient, to install into them positive new elements of the Über-Ich, of the above-I, so that they are less conflicted and are less bothered by an overly restrictive, overly judgmental voice inside of them, and becomes a more differentiated, a more benevolent voice. Freud emphasizes, though, that because of this privileged position of having access to the Über-Ich, to the above-I, analysts should be very careful and Freud emphasizes the independence of the patient. This should be done in a very careful way and in small measures only. This is the second advantage that is connected to positive transference. The third one is that transference allows insights into the patient's relationship with the parents. So because the patient sees me as the father, they start to behave to me in a certain way through my inner resonance, through my understanding of how I feel. I might ask the patient if this is what they experienced in childhood. So, for example, the patient is angry about me, right? Because I'm the supposed father, but he's angry about me in a very uncomfortable, stubborn, ugly way. And because I perceive this, it becomes a hypothesis for me as the analyst, as the therapist, and I might ask them if they experience something like this. Is this something that you were told, that you are ugly, that you are unattractive, that you are bothersome? And then this might help the patient to further associate in order to fill the gaps of his memory and the self-understanding. Now, the transference can not only be positive, it can turn negative. And with negative transference, there's also the risk of losing the successes of the past in the analysis, and also earlier insights into themselves might be questioned by the patient, so that with a negative transference, if it turns negative, they might toss the baby out with a bathing water, so to speak. The task of analysis in general is to unmask the supposedly fresh life as a reflection of the past and to learn from it. This is something that was important for Freud. If we are not understanding ourselves, integrating our past into the I, then we are doomed to repeat our maladapted patterns again and again and again. So when, this is from a Freudian perspective now, when patients might say, oh, I'm changing the job, everything will be different. I'm having a new relationship, now everything will be different. The analyst is quite cautious and has at least the attitude and voices it appropriately with a certain caution. Don't be too optimistic. After all, you're taking yourself into the new work. You're taking yourself into the new relationship. So continue to integrate so that you can change. And here's a quote from Freud: "The child is the father of the adult," which is a nice, mysterious quote. What it means is the child that I have been is the one that raised me. It turned into me. And in the sense also, as I said before, that the roots of the neurosis lie in the first 6 years of life and only show the symptoms later on. Also, in that sense, the child is the father of me as the adult. So self-knowledge is crucial in psychoanalysis in order to strengthen the ego, and also is aspect of this other quote that I said before, where it was, I shall become. And in psychoanalysis, the analyst wants the I to dare to do the dangerous and unpleasant thing, which is to face the drive demands of the it and to gain understanding of a maladaptive above I and Über-Ich structure. To face these is very uncomfortable, and psychoanalysis is a tool for Freud to help patients to dare this challenge, to dare facing the parts of myself that are so uncomfortable. Okay, let me come to a few general aspects of psychoanalysis. To a certain extent, according to Freud, children are all traumatized. And here, keep in mind the Latin root of the word trauma, which means injury or hurt. It is inevitable that children in their development are hurt from the outside, in the sense that the drive demands of the it are frustrated, are rejected. When parents say, no, not now, this is in a sense, for the very weak I of the young child, this is an injury, this is a hurt. And this is inevitable for Freud. But the child, also to understand the difficulty in that, the child also has to master in just a few years, especially nowadays, so much more than in Freud times, it has to master the cultural development that humanity needed thousands of years for, to become a valuable member of society today with all those exaggerated demands on self-control, self-development, compatibility, the stressful work environments, the interaction with social media, the complex forms of relationship with their demands on love of and connectedness nowadays. This is something that humanity developed over thousands of years. And a child, especially when it grows into adolescence, is required to do this in just a few years. So no wonder that this is such a high stress for the system. No wonder that the I has difficulties to absorb and integrate it all. Again, to summarize, in the neuroses, the I cannot longer fulfill the tasks of the outside world and society, either because of the inner pressures or because the demands of the outside are so strong. So then activity is inhibited by restrictions and the self-devaluation of the Über-Ich, of the above I. This is the inhibiting factor inside of us. And the remaining energy that is left, what is left from those inhibitions, the remaining energy is used up in the pointless attempt to defend itself against the demand of the it, because the it continues to press on. And so, because of the weakened I, the it breaks into the organization of the I and splits it into contradictory parts, contradictory aspirations, and unresolved conflicts. Psychoanalysis initially consists of intellectual interpretation. This is how we gain the trust. This is how we start generally explaining of what might happen and then letting the patient find its way into this way of thinking. So intellectual descriptions is the beginning of the psychoanalysis for Freud, in order to, on a provisional basis, fill the gaps, so that later on the patient can do this on their own with the accurate, with a complete filling of the gaps by working on themselves and discovering their understanding, discovering the understanding of their own past. If parts of the authority are transferred to the analyst in transference, if they're projected, the analysts encourage the I to take up the fight with the it and overcome the resistance of the Über-Ich. Then the patients deal with the unpleasantness of experiencing all this, the memories that it will bring up, solving the questions that it will bring up, and they verbalize it in the analysis. Then the patients and the analyst trace the intruded contents back to its origins, back into the neuroses of the first 6 years of life. And this is what previously was unconsciously repressed. This is what then becomes available to the I again. This is the integration into the I. I want to end with some prerequisites that Freud saw for a patient in order to engage into his psychoanalysis. The patient needs a strong desire for recovery, because otherwise the internal conflicts will sabotage the process. The patients need intellectual interest, an interest into filling those gaps of the mind. Positive transference is something that is typically necessary and used in psychoanalysis. And patients need the ability to sublimate drives. This is something that I have not described much before, but drive sublimation is to take it from its primitive source of the it that is not quite interested in how we solve this drive problem, how the I solves the drive problem, and we channel it into other ways of satisfaction that are much more socially acceptable, are much more acceptable to the outside world. For example, through career, so we sublimate libidinous demands through work, social activity, arts. These are all ways how to deal with those drive demands of the it and channel them through more beneficial paths. Disadvantages would be if patients had a tendency for negative transference, if they are unwilling to do the difficult psychological work of facing oneself, confronting oneself with those difficult energies. Psychological inertia, when people are dull, have difficulties to associate, cannot verbalize the stream of consciousness. And as I mentioned before, if they have a quite developed need for mental illness. Personally, when I look back at those works of the late Freud, I admire his style. He's very well aware of the concept that he uses. He tries to be precise. He doesn't want to be vague. He pushes the concepts that he has developed to fruition. What does it mean to have an Oedipus complex? What does it mean if the it and the Über-Ich starts to have a battle, with the I sandwiched in between? So he develops those concepts, but I think he goes too far. He doesn't see where his concepts come to a limit. Here he would have benefited from a bit more of consciousness philosophy, because then it would have been, I think, much more clear that how concepts have their own limit, and if we push them, they falsify themselves. They become meaningless because they are not valid as eternal truths. They don't hold in each and every situation. They are limited to a certain field where they make sense. And I think that Freud, with many of his concepts, he overstepped the natural kind of sense that his quite useful concepts like the it, the unconscious, the Über-Ich, his psychosexual stages, he overstepped their meaning, and he tried to defend them where they shouldn't be defended because they're just not valid. Also, the focus of Freud on the psychosexual development, this he took too literally when he spoke about the angst, the fear of castration, for example. He suggests in his writing that each and every boy goes through the same process, which is a literal fear of someone, let's say the dad, coming and chopping off his penis. And this, from today's perspective, and also I, as a historically interested reader, I cannot see that this is in any way true. He would have done better if he admitted that to a large extent we have to understand these as symbolic. So in the sense, I can understand that if at work my superior reprimands me, criticizes me in front of the whole team, it feels like some sort of a castration, that my power is inhibited, that I'm exposed in my vulnerability. So here, I don't have to say that I go back to a literal fear of being castrated. I think those concepts can maintain their reach if Freud had admitted that it can be either literally or also meant in a more symbolic way. All in all, for me, it's always interesting to go back to the big characters, be it in philosophy or psychology. I have the feeling that they knew much more of what they were developing in those concepts. Freud was, in his time, the avant-garde, or one of the avant-gardes, in developing psychotherapy. And the literature is rich. I think it is interesting to go back and to read those with the distance of the time, because I can distinguish for myself both quite well the gems that are in there and also the obvious flaws and mistakes that he made. This is it for today. I hope I gave you a complex enough introduction into Freud's work. Maybe you pick up a book of Freud, maybe you pick up literature on psychoanalysis and you rediscover some of the concepts that you have learned in those summaries. If you're interested in a consultation with me, you'll find a link below. Other than that, I'm happy to see you next time, and I hope you stay interested, and feel free also to subscribe to my channel to stay informed when another new video pops up. Thank you for your attention, and see you next time.